What's going on, everybody? It's Royja coming at you with a brand new video, and of course it's that time of the month where we go over our monthly tier list for the competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format, and this one's definitely going to be a big shaker because Cyberstorm Access is about to throw the entire game for a loop. With so many new strategies and updates for other strategies coming out, this set is looking to be massive, and even just the random free agent cards can be really big for certain lesser decks. Because of this, you may notice that the thing looks a bit off, like the way that the video is displayed in terms of the size, because this is the biggest tier list by far I've ever had to make. There is 3 rows, well technically 2 rows and then 1 extra, but 3 rows of decks that you can play, and there's basically a bunch more that I just couldn't even remember to include here. Sorry, Ninja players, I'm literally going to forget your deck until the end of time. I think there are so many decks that you can play come Cyberstorm Access format, especially if we get a good ban list along with it. So I don't want to waste any more time. Let's go ahead and get right into my competitive Yu-Gi-Oh tier list for the May 2023 format post Cyberstorm Access. Starting us off, we have Branded, and Branded I think can go easily in the tier 1 category. So there's a few things about Branded I do want to talk about though. So namely, the reason why I'm putting it up here is because of the brand new support coming out of Cyberstorm Access, looking to be really good for the deck. Things like Guiding Quem and Albion the Incandescent Dragon, and especially Despian Luluwa-Lilith. That's such a weird name to say. Say that like 5 times fast. Luluwa-Lilith, I'm not even gonna try. But this deck is about to receive a bunch of really cool cards coming out of Cyberstorm Access that are going to put the deck on a whole nother level. Not just in terms of how strong the combos are in general with all the extension you can play, but also just how the deck functions, especially when playing through cards like Ash Blossom, which has always been the bane of the deck's existence. But with things like Quem, you can actually extend using cards like Branded Opening or even Nadir's Servant in order to play like almost nothing happened. It basically just gives the deck so much more combo potential, as well as the ability to play through the cards that used to be really rough for the deck to play through. And I think that even with people prepared for it, it'll definitely be something that you'll want to keep an eye out for, because it will probably be seeing a lot of representation. Next, of course, we have to address the elephant in the room, y'all. Super Heavy Samurai is looking to be a really good deck. Funnily enough, I included like one of the worst cards out of the new support on here as the image, but I couldn't find a good random art render of Wakaushi, so my apologies there. But Super Heavy Samurai, this deck is so crazy. If y'all haven't seen it, I do have a replay video of me playing with this deck as a bad player, by the way. I'm not very good when it comes to these really heavy combo decks, but you can just put so many hand traps as like half the deck, and then the other half as Super Heavy Engine, and you can create like triple Omni Negate end boards and like 3 Monster Negate end boards, and then a bunch of random other things with like 5 cards still in your hand off of just 1 card. It's so wild. Not to mention that the representation of this deck is going to be absolutely massive, because as I expected, all of this stuff was printed really low rarity. I think it's like all commons and super rares, and then just the really old like random common stuff or super rare things that admittedly are a little bit up there in price, but mainly just because they're old and not because the deck's going to be just super expensive in general. Not to mention, even if you're not interested in playing pure Super Heavy Samurai, you can actually splash this engine into so many other decks. Like, I've seen Madolche Super Heavy, Naturia Super Heavy. Basically any Earth related deck can really benefit from these cards. Anything with the Vernisylphs. I even think I saw something involving Math Mech Super Heavy. Don't quote me on that. Like, I don't know. It's just because it's like 2 1-card combo engines, so I might be tripping just thinking of it, but it sounds like a pretty funny idea. And then of course, so long as Cyberstein is legal, this deck is also always going to be able to FTK, and I think there's even a Kara Curry variant that could rip your entire hand out, which is really funny. Basically, TLDR, there are so many different things you can do with this deck, and the amount of potency it has is off the charts. And unless we get like some preemptive hit to things like Cyberstein, I think this is going to be one of the most rampant decks in the format. The only reason I'm keeping it under Branded is because a lot of people are probably going to be preparing for it, which might end up actually bumping it down to 1.5 depending on how this ban list looks. But I don't know, we'll just have to see. Again, this is a bit preemptive, but it is going in the tier 1 category for now. Next up on our list, we have Purely, and I think I want to put Purely in the 1.5 category. So Purely is a bit of an interesting one, because as we're seeing over in the OCG, this deck is dominating. I think it is currently still the top deck. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know Vanquish Soul is also doing really good over there, unfortunately, because I say unfortunately because I really want to pick up the deck and it's going to be expensive, but Purely is a deck that I think over here isn't going to do as good, even with the brand new support coming out of Cyberstorm Access, being the Purely Lily as well as the Sleepy Memory. Both of those cards are absolutely fantastic for the deck. but I do think the deck is going to be very, very prepared for things like Droll and Lockbird especially, and there's even super heavy players that are playing Spell Canceller in their side for the matchup like this, which is really rough for the deck. Not to mention that there are just so many other random counters, using Anti-Spell in order to bait out the cards early, like in the draw or standby phase. And then of course, as always, we have a bunch of things over here that the OCG does not have. I believe this deck plays through Max C pretty well or whatever, but we don't have Max C, so it's definitely a bit more less overwhelming of the deck, I should say. I still think it's going to be a good deck, don't get me wrong, especially as long as Castra is still a deck. Zeus is always going to be a really powerful card. However, it's definitely a bit of a one-trick pony. It's just make a Towers or make a big Zeus. And the other plays that the deck has are really good. Again, I do have like 2 different replay videos, I'm pretty sure, of this deck up on the channel. They are pretty cool, but they're a bit specific. Things like the Graveyard Stealing off of the Plump, that's what it's called, the one that summons off a Delicious Memory. It has plays, but it's definitely not as potent as a deck like Super Heavy Samurai. Not to mention, again, I think this deck is a lot easier and will be a lot more frequently prepared for than a deck like Super Heavy. So I do believe that it can probably peak in the 1.5 category for now, but honestly, I could see it dropping down to tier 2, but it really depends on the representation, which is probably going to be pretty low considering the price of the deck. Next on our list, we have Makonko, and I'm going to put Makonko in tier 2. So Makonko is an interesting deck. Going second, this deck is very, very potent. I mean, if you open a board breaker or like anything that mass negates anything that might be a removal card, or if their only removal is like destruction or something, or even targeting now with Fury coming out of the Cyberstorm access, the deck can actually end up getting a really sneaky OTK in. However, it's definitely a bit underwhelming when it's forced to go first, especially, not to mention that going second, it's again, much like Purely, especially even more so, it's a bit of a one-trick pony if you're literally just going for the OTK off of punching your opponent's things, especially if they end on things that aren't really big, because it's not like a deck like Lyrilusk, for example, where you can use Recital Starling to boost up your opponent's stuff before crashing. You're basically just hard relying on your opponent having a bunch of things or one really big thing. Well, if they're playing a deck like Purely, whatever they summon isn't going to be like the biggest thing. It's going to be pretty damn big, but it's not going to be absolutely massive. Not to mention that I think overall the best way to play this deck in general is the Libromancer build. I think the Libromancer Makonko build is really, really cool, especially because it can go first and second really well. But if you're playing the deck pure, I think there's definitely a lot more room for improvement than you might think. I've tried out a bunch of different versions of this deck. I've tried out the Libromancer build. I've tried out the Kaiju build. That one was really funny. I tried that out on the channel. I've tried a bunch of different ways to play the deck. I think the Libromancer one is probably the best way to play it, but we'll just have to see which one is the most represented. Next on our list, we have Manadome, or Manadium as it has been localized. I still think Manadome is a better name, but whatever. I'm also going to put this in the tier 2 category. I think Manadome has some really high potential. I think it's a deck a lot like Super Heavy Samurai where it can make some really crazy combo end boards, but the main issue is that you can't play as many flex spots as Super Heavy Samurai. It's a lot more fragile than Super Heavy Samurai. A lot of plays, as my friend Kate over on Twitter actually ended up saying, it dies a lot to just Ghost Ogre on normal summon Rumheart. And then finally, it just requires a lot more openers than Super Heavy does, because you have to open like multiple Manadome cards, like the Scareclaw engine, Visa, stuff like that, or like a Hero Lives. I know there's like the 1-card Hero Lives combo, but you're having your life points just to die to Ash. So I think the deck is basically just Super Heavy Samurai, but weaker with less flex spots in the extra deck and the main, and just a lot more clunky overall. I think it's a really cool deck. I think it can make some really potent end boards, and the combos I mentioned, yeah, you have to open like 2 cards most of the time, but they're not specific or anything. You're not having to open like very specific things just to play your deck. But I think if you want to play a combo deck that's honestly maybe a little cheaper, especially because the Super Heavy Samurai stuff, especially compared to the Visa stuff, especially now that Scareclaw Rykard's peaking at like $30+, I think you're better off just playing Super Heavy. Next up on our list is a deck that's honestly really close to my heart. We have Dinomorphia. I think Dinomorphia can be a really strong contender this format, especially with a deck like Tier Limit out of the meta, and with Sword Soul kind of lagging behind compared to what people expected of it. Dinomorphia has basically a lot less outs than people thought it would. The main reason Dinomorphia has returned to this list, though, is because of Dinomorphia Accession, whatever it's called. What is it named? Dinomorphia Intact. I'm thinking of like the Dark World card. Dinomorphia Intact. Their brand new counter trap coming out of Cyberstorm Access that not only serves as an archetypal Solemn Strike if you control any Dinomorphia card face up, this includes your fusion trap, so it does stop Ash, but also it allows you to basically not be able to be killed that entire turn, because any battle damage, it might be a battle and effect, but I think it's just battle damage, that you take for the rest of that turn, it becomes half your life points instead. This is massive for the deck for so many different reasons, because not only are you stopping Ash, but even if you do still get hit by something else that might stop you, you're still not going to be able to die that turn, giving you a turn for follow-up, which is really big in a trap deck like itself. This isn't even the only reason that Dynamorphy has gotten better though, because as a lot of other trap decks will be enjoying, we're receiving Wannabe. Wannabe is a really cool card coming out of Cyberstorm Access for trap decks that sort of functions like a pot of prosperity during the end phase, grabbing any trap off the top up to 5 of your deck, and then, yeah, it sends it to the graveyard during the next end phase, but you're probably going to be using it, especially in a deck like Dynamorphia that lives and dies by its fusion traps being accessible. Do I think Dynamorphia is going to be the best trap deck to utilize Wannabe? Probably not. You got decks like Labyrinth still running around that are basically just better, but it makes the deck so much less clunky, because not only are you grabbing your fusion traps if you don't have access to like Theritzia or if she gets impermed, but you're also grabbing traps that you need that aren't the ones in your hand, because as a Dynamorphia player, from first-hand experience, you're going to end up drawing a lot of like your cards that require Dynamorphias on field, things like your Brute, Sonic, Alert requiring ones engraved, things like that, and you're going to draw those and not have access to any of your better ones. Well, Wannabe is going to be able to make the ones in your hand, yeah, there's probably still dead, but you're definitely still grabbing things from the top that could save you for that turn, especially if you do end up hitting one of your fusion traps. I think Dynamorphia, again, isn't going to be like the best trap deck you could play, but I think it's going to be a very sneaky strong contender that people aren't going to be prepared for, especially with just how strong Rexstorm is in a format like this. Next up on our list, we have Plunder Patrol, and man, I had such high hopes for Plunder Patrol, but in a format where Kastra is a deck and there's a mass macro Cosmos on the board on legs, it's basically going to stop any sort of chance the deck has, not to mention that there are just a bunch of other factors making Plunder Patrol a lot weaker of a deck than it could be, and it just kind of can't keep up as well with the other decks, even with something like Yord and like the Rivalry Lock and everything like that. I think it still has potential. I think a really dedicated Plunder Patrol pilot could end up topping a YCS with it, but for now, I'm going to put it in the rogue category. Maybe if Kastra gets hit significantly on the list, we'll see it come a little bit more into fruition. Next on our list is Sword Soul. I'm going to put Sword Soul in tier 2, so I haven't been keeping up with regionals lately, so please do not crucify me if we end up having like a bunch of Sword Soul in the most recent regionals and I'm just tripping and I'm an idiot. Like, flame me in the comments, don't crucify me though, but Sword Soul, to my memory, has not been doing very well. Not to mention that we're going to see a lot of cards like Nibiru or even Ghost Ogre coming up in the next format for things like Super Heavy, Mana Dome, etc. And it's definitely going to make Sword Soul even weaker of a deck. I think it's still very strong, but I think a lot of decks are just going to be able to play through its pretty weak end board overall, especially decks like Super Heavy, and then you got decks that can play a bunch of hand traps also like Super Heavy, and just packing the deck full of disruptions for Sword Soul to be unable to play. I think it's going to be a lot weaker than a lot of people had hoped for last format, and it's just been spiraling slowly downhill, and now I think this one is going to plummet. It's not a bad deck, so I'm going to keep it in tier 2. It's definitely going to top here and there, especially the regional scene, but I do think that there are a lot of other decks you can play, especially with how affordable things like Super Heavy are. Next on our list is Dark World, and I think Dark World is definitely a strong deck. But the main thing about it, I'm going to put it under Dynamorphia, above Makanko, not too sure. I think in terms of representation, actually, I'll put it above Dynamorphia. I think Dark World's a good deck when it can pop off, but the problem comes with popping off. Not to mention, the Kastra matchup is pretty poor, especially with all the dangers and stuff. And then, speaking of the dangers, if you don't open them most of the time, you're going to end up having very clunky hands. We're getting really cool new stuff. I think it's out of Duelist Nexus. It's actually Animation Chronicles, so we're probably not even going to get it until a Battles of Legends. So when we get Colorless, I think this deck will spike up significantly, both in price and representation. Especially because, I mean, just like quick effect board nuke is crazy. But right now, I think the deck is just, it's not that amazing. It's fine if you want to play it for sure. I'm not going to like say you're bad for playing it, but you could play something better. Again, I'm going to keep mentioning Super Heavy. It's cheap. It's really strong. It's basically tier 1 guaranteed. So up to you, really. I mean, it's not really something I would play, especially because it's a bit complicated for me, especially also because the end boards are just so flexible, but it's just a completely so-so deck. Next on our list is Madolche, and I'm going to put Madolche in the rogue category above Plunder Patrol. So Madolche is a bit interesting because it got significantly weakened by the limiting of the Ishizu cards, making it to where the Vernisylph build is a little bit more favorable. And also, again, you can play super heavy and stuff in this deck. I've seen like a super heavy list in the OCG doing wild stuff with this, and I think there was also one in like an online tournament that was running it. But at that point, if you're running Vernisylphs and or the super heavies and stuff, or the Ishizu cards, whatever, why not just play Naturia? Because you're basically doing the same stuff, because you're basically using the same packages, but getting better results in a more compact engine that isn't as bricky. Like, you can do so much more with Naturia as a deck and have more follow-up and just be much more consistent instead of playing Madolche and like praying your opponent doesn't have a hand trap or any sort of like big disruption like Nib, opening the specific things, not opening your Pudding Cess if you're playing the Pudding Cess. Like, basically the only thing saving this deck is Tiara Masu still being such a ridiculously strong card. But overall, I think you could basically just be better off playing any other deck, you know? Next on our list is Drytron. I think Drytron is going to be a very good deck. A lot of people still don't prepare for it. It just has so many different ways of locking you down from playing. The biggest issue is the Castra matchup, but if Castra does get hit on the ban list, at least in some form of capacity, things like Diablosis to make it less powerful, it's not going to be as bad for the deck to play through. And if for some reason a Rise Heart got hit, I don't think it will, obviously, like we literally just got the support, this deck basically becomes like massive, especially because Macro Cosmos was the biggest thing holding this deck back. But I think even with that in mind, if you're not playing against Castra, you're going to win a lot of your games if you just open well. But I think this deck is really strong if it doesn't get hit by one of those powerful side deck cards. Next on our list, we have Eldritch, and Eldritch is still not going to be doing very great. Admittedly, it does get access to Wannabe, which is a really good card for all trap decks, but this is probably one of the worst trap decks you can play due to the walking Macro Cosmos. You can't use your Eldritch, you lose your graveyard stuff, and there's just so many other trap decks you could play than Eldritch, so really I would just pick something else. Next on our list is Fluanderies. I think Fluanderies is going to go probably below... I think it can go below Monodium, maybe above, one of the two. I'm going to put it below just in case, because this might take more people by surprise. But mainly the big thing about Flu is that while it was really, really good in our last format, Droll is a card, not to mention a bunch of other anti-draw, anti-search cards that are probably going to end up popping up here and there. So I think Flu is going to be a lot worse in that regard. Not to mention, it was more so like things like Harpy's Featherstorm carrying the deck and like double Empen and everything, but if it doesn't go first, it's not really in for a great time. Next up, we have Exo Sister, and I mean, okay. I don't have it in my heart to put this deck higher than Rogue. I know, oh my god, it's topping here and there. Y'all, just play something else, please. I'm so sick of hearing Exo Sister players act like their deck is like the top shit. It's like, why would you play this deck over something else? I don't care if you top the regional. It's not that great. Next up, we have Draco Slayer. Draco Slayer, such a cool deck. But honestly, there's going to be a lot of things like Anti-Spell and other things siding against things like Super Heavy Samurai. Castra is still a deck blocking off the pen scales. Yeah, it's going to be pretty rough until we eventually get a Shangri-La hit. Speaking of Castra, we have Castra right here. I'm going to put it at the top of tier 1. Even if something like Diablosis is gone, I think this is going to be the strongest deck of the format still. It has really easy matchups against things like Super Heavy, again by blocking the pen scales, hitting Branded with things like Ash, and then having a big end board on top of that for them to play through. It's going to be really rough because they can't access their Dragoon plays. It outs a lot of other decks like Purely by banishing their things instead of putting them in the graveyard. They can't use things like Lily. It's got basically an out for almost any single deck this format. Also, take a shot every time I say basically this video, Jesus Christ. And even with Diablosis being potentially banned in order to make their potency a lot weaker, I think it's definitely going to be the biggest threat of the format. It's just such a powerful deck, y'all. Next on our list, we have Labyrinth. I'm going to put Labyrinth in the bottom of 1.5. It saw a lot less representation, especially because of like both price and just dipping out of the format in general because of just stronger decks overall. But I think with things like Castra potentially getting hit, especially with how good of a branded matchup that it has, it's also pretty decent against a deck like Pendulum, because I'm pretty sure you can declare Pendulum with D-Barrier and stuff, and I think it prevents them from Pendulum summoning, right? You can't special summon Pendulum monsters period, so it just shuts off the Wakaushi and shit in general. Not to mention, again, things like Wannabe, you have a lot more potency in order to search those cards like Dimensional Barrier or your Welcome Labyrinth off of that card off the top of your deck. So I think it's going to be a really strong deck. I just wish the price would go down a little bit, you know? Okay, you know what? Shut my mouth. This isn't that bad. Next up on our list, we have Virtual World, and they got a brand new rank 9 out of Cyberstorm access. The main problem is that it's shit. Like, it's terrible. They don't have enough gates in order for it to be, like, really, really good or anything like that. And the deck is still as clunky as ever. Honestly, I wouldn't even play the new rank 9. It just looks kind of bad. So, yeah, I'm sorry. Next up on our list is Math Mech, and I'm going to put this in our 1.5 category. I think Math Mech is still a super strong deck. There's nothing really in the future for this deck to get hit by any means. I don't think you are going to be playing Bell as much, correct me if I'm wrong, for your Super Factorial and stuff. You can still fit a bunch of hand traps in, which, as according to Super Heavy, it's going to be really good for the format. And again, speaking of Super Heavy, you might be able to match those decks together. Again, tell me in the comments if that is a possibility. I think you can start off with the Super Heavy stuff first and then pivot into your Math Mech plays. I'm not too sure. I know the Math Mech stuff locks you into Cybers is the big thing. I think this deck is just super strong still. There's nothing really holding it back except for Castora, but even against Castora, this deck has been holding its own in a lot of the format. So I think it's going to be in the 1.5 category. Another deck that's going to go up there is Naturia. I think Naturia is really, really cool. Not to mention, again, you can combine this with Super Heavy and do a bunch of really cool shenanigans there. Like, you can end on an entire Super Heavy board of like 2 to 3 Omnis and stuff, and have a Nap Beast, and have Naturia follow up Engrave with the Sunflower and Camellia hitting the board for double Monster Negate next turn. That just sounds like terrifying. Yeah, Dark Ruler is probably going to end up being a thing, which is going to be really, really big, but Mole Cricket can hit the board after the Dark Ruler ends up going off, so it's not really that bad. So yeah, unless we end up getting a hit for this deck by any means, which I don't really think it will. I think it's a good card, but it's not really going to get, like, massacred or anything. So yeah, unless this deck ends up getting hit for some reason, which, I mean, I think it's a good deck, but it's not, like, super good by any means, so I don't think it's going to happen. This deck's probably going to stay in the 1.5 category for a good while. Next on our list, we have Dragon Link, and I'll put Dragon Link... I'll put up above Dynamorphia because it has a bit more guaranteed, like, representation and stuff. The biggest thing about Dynamorphia is representation, unfortunately. But Dragon Link, I don't think is getting anything too crazy. I think the best thing they're getting is Chaos Angel, but there's a lot of other decks that can utilize Chaos Angel just better. Not to mention, the matchup against Castora and, like, a bunch of other decks is still pretty poor. And Branded still always has the option, at least, like, the option, they don't play it all the time, to go into, like, Albalenitus and stuff, so they can kind of just out the entire Dragon Link board. So, as always, why I don't think the deck is bad, it just has a pretty matchup against a lot of the other decks right now, especially Castora, so it's probably going to stay in tier 2 for a while. Next on our list, we have Runic. So, Runic is interesting to me, because this is going to include just, like, mostly Runic itself, but also, like, a lot of Runic variants, like Runic Sprite, stuff like that. I think Runic is probably going to get hit in some capacity on the next list. Like, I can't wait to go back and look at this video, like, a few days after where it gets posted, because probably one of the ban lists is going to come out. But I think that we're going to see either a tip or a fountain hit in some capacity, because Runic has just been absolutely dominating lately. So, I'm going to put it in tier 2. I'm going to put it probably above Manadium, whatever you want to call it, below Sword Soul. Just as a precaution, it could end up bumping up to 1.5 if it doesn't get hit, but I think it is going to see some form of hit in just some way, shape, or form, because it's just such a potent engine. This is just me being preemptive, but again, just remember it can go to 1.5 easily. The variants of it can, if it doesn't get hit at all. Next on our list is Trap Tricks. I still have high hopes for Trap Tricks. I think this deck is really good. I think a lot of people just ended up, like, dropping it when it didn't see, like, immediate success. Not to mention, it was mostly just a lot of representation because it was super cheap and pack hype and everything like that. I think it's still a really good deck. You still have access to some really cool cards like Exciton Knight. And again, this deck can probably benefit from Wannabe if you're playing a super trap-focused version of it, which I personally don't, but I mean, whatever, it doesn't really matter. I think you could easily top an event with Trap Tricks if you really put your heart to it. The main thing is that it requires a dedicated pilot instead of just some person that randomly picked up 3 structure decks and some extra cards. Next on our list is Sky Striker, and I think Sky Striker is probably going to stay in the rogue category. I'll put it above Plunder Patrol, below Madolche, because Madolche gets access to the super heavy stuff. I think Sky Striker still has a really bad matchup against Castra, and there's just so many other cards like Spell Canceller and stuff being used now in order to out decks like Super Heavy. So you're basically getting punished for playing Sky Striker because the other decks are good. I hate when that happens in a format, but I mean, whatever, Sky Striker players deserve it. Next on our list, we have Tri-Brigade, and this is also very banlist dependent, but I have less hopes for some more coming back than I do for Runic getting hit. So I'm going to keep this in the rogue category. I think it's still a really good deck. The main problem is Castra is such a poor matchup no matter what variant you're playing. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to keep it in the rogue category. I love Bird Up. I love Tri-Brigade in general, but especially Bird Up. And I think if we get Samorg, it can be really, really good. But Shifter, Walking Macrocosmos, all of these cards just end up being a really big issue. So unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be moving from here anytime soon, even with a Samorg Unlimit. Next on our list is Sprite, and Sprite interests me. Like, it really does, because I want to put it at the bottom of tier 1. The main issue with things like Droll, the Sprite engine itself, not so much like the Beaver and everything like that, any of the outside engines, but the Sprite engine itself, for the most part, becomes a lot more difficult to play. Like, usually you can still full combo, I'm pretty sure, because all it requires is like the 2 bodies on board. I think that gets you a full combo and to access like anything you want, like Ibly and stuff like that, which I can see getting hit on this next list, not gonna lie. But I think because you can still play at least around Droll a little bit, while your board won't be as potent, I think Sprite can perfectly play through it just fine most of the time. Not to mention, even if they can't, they usually play a bunch of hand traps or board breakers or things like that. So I think Sprite, while it's definitely weaker than something like Super Heavy as a deck in my opinion, I think Sprite is still a really, really strong deck, unless it gets hit on the ban list, in which case it can probably bump down to 1.5 or even 2. Next up we have Marincess, and I want Marincess to go probably above, I'm gonna put it above Dragon Link, below Dark World. Actually, I'll put it above Dark World and Fluanderies. I think this deck is really, really cool. It's been seeing a lot more success lately, especially in the regional scene, even if it is like a worse math mech. However, we are getting access to Ice Jade Adrian Ron, or Ice Jade Ron Adrian, whatever the localization is, which is a really, really cool card for Marincess, because it basically allows the deck to access really nice synchro plays. Because it discards a water monster from your hand for cost in order to special summon itself, and you can summon a token, which basically locks you into water, but it's not that big of a deal. But that can not only access level 10 synchro plays, or even level 7 synchro plays if you have a level 4 on board, but you can also go for some really cool Link 2 plays, getting a free Coral Anemone, which is one of the best cards the archetype has. Really, really nice for the deck, but mainly being able to make things like Cheng Ying or even the Ice Jade Adrian Geimer. I think both of these cards are going to be really good for the archetype. I think that just getting access to such an awesome extender, especially when a single disruption, especially Ghost Ogre, can end up being really bad for the archetype, I think it's going to be really cool for the deck, and I think it can definitely see a lot more success. Next on our list is Rika, or Rika Sun Avalon, whatever you want to call it, depending on whatever build you're playing. I think this is a really, really strong deck that a lot of people are sleeping on. I'm going to put it below Sword Soul, above Trap Tricks. I think it's going to see a lot more representation than people might think, especially with all the reprints out of Maze of Memories, making the deck a lot cheaper, especially for those looking for a rogue option. The main issue with this deck is that it lacks spell and trap negation, but you can easily supplement this with things like, I think it's the Rose Archer can negate traps, really good against cards like Evenly Match, which I think is going to be more potent than ever this format, but also having more variety in their disruption than just monsters, like things like Rika Sheet, allows them to play through cards like Dark Ruler, also Rika Princess. You can just play through those board breakers a lot better than a lot of other rogue decks can, so I think putting it in the tier 2 category isn't that big of a stretch. Invoked players, please just get some help. Tearlament, I still think, is a lot weaker than people are still trying to give it credit for. I've seen a lot of people try to make this deck work. I think you'd be better off playing a lot of other decks, because this deck is literally just gambling. I don't care that it topped an event. It was literally just all random pure luck. Not to mention, with all of the other decks coming around this format, you're going to have an even worse time, especially with all these Omnis from the Super Heavy Samurai or other really powerful combo decks like that. I think you'd be better off trying to not cope on Tearlament. And then finally, Dinosaur. We don't have the new stuff coming just yet, so it is going to go into Rogue. I'm going to put it actually in higher Rogue, because I think this deck is really, really good at breaking the really powerful combo boards, especially when it has cards like Dark Ruler in their hand. But with cards like Ash around, for Branded is going to be very difficult, especially with Mist still at 1, but I can see Mist going to 2 and then 3, or even straight to 3 because of the new support, so that might end up swaying this deck's results a lot. But also just breaking boards going second, blinding second with this deck is just so powerful, and so I am going to put it at the top of the road category. Holy shit. This was a massive tier list. I don't think I've ever made a tier list this big. Actually, I know I've never made a tier list this big. 3 different rows, almost 40 minutes, with me cutting down the time that I usually do for a lot of my tier lists. Look at all of these different decks you can play, not counting a bunch of other different things right now, like Ninja, etc. This format is probably going to be really chaotic, but I think depending on how you play and how you build your deck, and what you play, you can probably have more fun in this format than you have in a long while, especially if the ban list ends up hitting a lot of the problem cards this format, things like Dimensional Barrier, Diablosis, maybe even Eradicator, things like that, depending on if you're a branded player or not. I think this is going to be a really cool format. I think it's going to be really interesting. Tell me in the comments below what you plan on playing this format, if you have something in mind. I'm probably going to keep on playing Bird Up, especially if Samorg ends up coming back, but I might go to Branded if I can end up affording the Quem and Albion, Lilith, all those things like that. But I don't know, just let me know in the comments, because that's going to do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like, as well as put this video and the channel into recommended. And if you like this content, you also like it, like the rest of my tier list, then perhaps consider subscribing, because we're on the way to 5,000 subscribers by the end of 2023. Not to mention, it supports the channel more than anything else, and it's absolutely free. Once again, I'd like to plug my Patreon that I do have in the description below, where you can get some really cool benefits for really cheap every month, so be sure to check that out if you feel like supporting me directly. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.